In 1825, a prominent socialist spoke to a joint session of the United States Congress. He wasn't there to denounce his ideology. In fact, he'd been invited to expound upon his new system of society based upon principles of strict justice and impartial kindness. He was also there to condemn capitalism as a very injurious surplus of wealth and power to the few, promulgating poverty and subjection on the many. 5 former and current presidents, including 2 of the creators of the Declaration of Independence, attended Robert Owens's lecture, and Congress applauded his ideas. It was quite the event. Yet now we often hear that socialism is fundamentally opposed to American ideals.
To the right, never to the right, never to the left, forever to the right.
The Supreme Court disagreed when they ruled more than a century later that none of this, as in the nationalization of the means of production, is necessarily incompatible with the general political philosophy of the Constitution as outlined above by the government. This country is still home to more communes than anywhere else. Left-wing movements have played an integral role in American progress. So where does this notion of socialism and communism being un-American come from? In order to suppress progress, conservatives and liberals scaremongered about some red menace that is subverting our institutions in order to create an underclass insurrection that will destroy the nation. It took a long time for this tactic to become common and effective. Redbaiting, as it's called, hurt millions of Americans throughout history and continues to do so. I'd like to thank my patrons on Patreon for, without their support, this massive effort would not have been possible. Hey, Cypher here. I've been wanting to do an episode about redbaiting for a decade. It was always just too gargantuan of a topic. Using anti-communism as a ploy to suppress marginalized people's progress is well understood as a recent phenomenon, but rarely explained as a long-term problem throughout American history. Nor do we see much intellectual history about how redbaiting grew and changed as a concept. The closest I could find was this book, and it's actually pretty bad since it lacks citations. But at least it's from a university press, but, without citations it actually makes it technically worse than this video. I always include my footnotes on screen, and there's a bibliography below. We need a more complete history of redbaiting, which is what I hope this episode will provide by combining several works together. There's been this perennial question among labor historians, which is, why is there no substantial American left? Our politics are so warped that we often call liberals leftists, which they are not. The easy answer is that socialism is somehow incompatible with American freedom. But that's all patently false. We've had strong leftist movements before, and there's groups that would probably be identified as leftists, but that came before that whole concept came about. Many of these figures, like abolitionists, populists, progressives, and civil rights leaders, we hold as quintessential American heroes. The answer to why leftism is so weak here is redbaiting, as in scaremongering about some leftist cabal destroying our country. Far too often, historians really only talk about the first Red Scare and McCarthyism to explain how redbait has permeated our political discourse. It hasn't always been that way, and looking at only 2 outbreaks, significant though they may be, ignores the much greater picture, which one must grasp to fully understand why this is such a standard and effective strategy for those who are deficient in actual policy goals, making for a distinctively American form of demagoguery, one which is deeply harmful. So this immense episode is about how that came to be. I had to do all this research, reading much more than the selected bibliography below. So indulge me in my curiosity, since I've been wanting to make this for an entire decade now. In order to do so, we have to comprehend what exactly leftism, communism, and redbaiting are. The simple definition of communism is an ideology which proposes collective ownership of something, derived from the communes during the Middle Ages, which sought mutual defense beginning in the 10th century, effectively becoming city-states unto themselves. Religious communism, of course, predates this. For instance, the New Testament states that early Christians were of one heart and mind, and no one claimed that any of his possessions was his own, but they had everything in common. Christians would often turn to communism in compliance with these principles. Monasteries often operated as communes. Radical breakaways from Catholicism also took up this idea, such as Cathars, Taborites, and most notably Anabaptists. In this way, the Munster Rebellion could be seen as the first communist revolution, hence its brutal suppression. But many of these groups, such as Hutterites, Mennonites, and especially Amish, still form international communities within the United States today, proving that religious communism is still compatible with American traditions. This is sometimes labeled communalism to differentiate it from later forms, but it is communism. Those Pennsylvania Dutch, they're a bunch of red commies.
You know, you people are nothing like the communists they show on TV.
We now return to the communists.
Then came socialism on the other hand, emerging as a secular form of communism. These were groups that formed communes in response to societal inequalities, often theorizing new ways of organizing society in order to make them more fair, just, or whatever, in the form of some sort of ideal society. Many got their start as radicals during the French Revolution.
In the name of the people of France, France.
Henri de Saint-Simon theorized ways to order society so that laborers could equally share the fruits of their work, and eliminate the ability of parasitic elites to take most profits for themselves. It was one of his followers who coined the term socialism. Fourierism was particularly popular in the United States, with several communes founded throughout, sometimes calling themselves associationists or American phalanx. Robert Owen founded his factory towns on these socialist principles. Many socialists sought a more equitable society through reforming existing governments to eventually end capitalism, and would label Owens and his ilk as utopians to demean them. These democratic socialists became particularly popular in the United States during the turn of the century. Even our Pledge of Allegiance was written by a Christian socialist named Francis Bellamy, though hilariously the under God part was added as a redbaiting measure, somehow making it more in line with his socialism. Throughout the 19th century, there were so many different strains of socialism that became popular in the United States that the general idea of advocating for a more equitable society on behalf of workers' rights became known as labor republicanism, something that many early Republican Party members openly supported, especially Horace Greeley. Demsocks are further differentiated from social democrats, who seek to reform the system for equality alone, allowing capitalism to continue. Social democrats somewhat blend into progressivism, which is a deeply American tradition. Another strain was anarchism, which envisioned societies without hierarchical power.
What kind of garbage is that? Oops, my anarchy symbol.
Pierre-Joseph Proudhon saw potential in periods where the ruling class had ceased to function, called anarchy, and thought there was a way to order society to take advantage of that, granting even more liberty from governments whose sole purpose was to protect property accumulation. Mikhail Bakunin argued that workers could form their own federations instead of states, eliminating deprivation and hierarchies through labor unions, which is sometimes called syndicalism. But one figure would define these traditions more than any other. While earning his doctorate in philosophy at the University of Jena, Karl Marx joined a group known as the Young Hegelians. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, that's too many names, was kind of the figurehead of many Romantic philosophers who theorized a way of understanding what the spirit of the times is or was, also known as the zeitgeist. A status quo gave rise to its opposition, eventually resolving into a new norm that incorporated both. This is called the Hegelian dialectic, where you have a thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Young Hegelians thought there needed to be radical critiques of the status quo in order to initiate the dialectic. Marx criticized capitalism, theorizing that the drive of history was not nations and instead were class struggle. The material circumstances of people's economic positions determine their lives more than anything else. So in his view, the French Revolution resulted in the rise of the bourgeoisie, as in the middle class, to dominance, beginning the era of capitalism. Ancient history was defined by rulers exploiting slaves, medieval times by aristocrats exploiting peasantry, and modernity by the bourgeoisie exploiting urban labor, also known as proletarians. Every time a lower class would rise up in defiance of the upper class, it would result in a new upper and lower class. Capitalism's exploitation siphoned wealth from proletarians who did all the labor necessary to build those fortunes, which would supposedly become so oppressive that the proletariat would eventually overthrow capitalism, due to its own internal contradictions.
Capitalist exploitation will contest it and protest it.
Marx believed that the next revolution would result in a proletarian dictatorship, and this would be the last world revolution, as they would first implement a kind of temporary socialism before the state as a whole would wither away, resulting in communism, basically combining socialism and anarchism. So people who follow Marx's idea of a socialist revolution turning into a commune are called communists most of the time, or just Marxists, but the terms can be interchangeable. And socialism often is very much based on Marx's ideas as well. It's all fluid. Prussia banned Marx's first newspaper, so he went into exile along with his friend and co-author Friedrich Engels, who would help sustain Marx throughout his life, despite Marx's sometimes contemptuousness. They would form several communist organizations dedicated to this ideology of moving from proletarian control to statelessness. Marxism would evolve further throughout his lifetime, especially when he joined the International Working Men's Association. This first international tried to form solidarity between all these different ideologies, following various conservative repressions in the 1860s. This is what is generally considered leftism, running the gamut between socialism, communism, and anarchism. The word originates from those who would sit on the left side of the king during the early French Revolution because they opposed the aristocratic privilege of the other two estates in the General Assembly. As time passed, and liberalism became the norm, those seeking to upend the current hierarchy would continue to be called leftists, and those wishing to preserve or even reverse the status quo were to the right, yielding the political left-wing to right-wing spectrum we perpetuate today. One may debate whether progressives are leftists, but liberals are at the center. As would become traditional, these high ideals clashed, causing much leftist infighting and eventually the disintegration of the First International after the Paris Commune failed in 1871. A second international would similarly break apart, eventually becoming dominated by Marxists. One ideologue in this second international who left a lasting change was Vladimir Lenin, who argued that a vanguard could ignite a revolution and guide it through the stages of dialectical materialism. His version of Marxism would implement the first successful leftist revolution in 1917, beginning Soviet Russia. This very narrow definition of communism, as in a vanguard party leading a country through their specific version of Marxism, is often conflated with the entirety of the left.
Must crush Crush capitalism.
Indeed, vanguardism does not have any American tradition to it, with the exception of Black Panthers, which I've covered elsewhere. But Marxism absolutely does.
You will be brainwashed! Me? America's son? Ha! That will be a challenge. Our enemies are all those in league with imperialism. The bureaucrats, the big landlord class, and the reactionary section of the intelligentsia attached to them.
It affects almost every political ideology we consider mainstream. Social liberals, as in the main kind of liberals that comprise the Democratic Party, are the outcome of the New Left countercultural movement. New Right luminaries like Daniel Bell and Irving Kristol got their beginnings as Marxists, who turned against Sovietization of radicalism. Such converts play a strong role in today's conservatism. Reactionaries often invoke Antonio Gramsci, an Italian Marxist, to explain that political power is ultimately dependent on cultural power. The even further right is often explicitly taking a third position from liberalism and leftism to institute a new nationalism for all proletarians and peasants who they deem pure enough. Yes, even fascists, which is about as right-wing as one can go, took inspiration from their enemies. Ideology is never so narrow-minded as to exclude influence from its competition, nor monolithic enough to be nailed entirely down as one particular aspect.
You just don't understand that Western civilization is rapidly being destroyed by these postmodern neo-Marxist postmodern cultural types.
That'll be $2,000. Pure ideology.
Damn it, man, I'm a historian, not a pundit. If you're unwilling to grapple with the full complexity of humanity, then you're not willing to learn the story of us, as in history. Remember, complexity is one of the 5 C's of history. Now, I could go into minutiae and cover so many different strains, because leftists are endlessly fractious.
Judean People's Front. The People's Front of Judea.
But this is enough to understand the larger differences. Anarchists, socialists, and communists certainly had their adherents throughout American history. But this was largely ideology. We will get into some of the ways they tried to implement and propagate their ideology, called praxis. Some turned to violence as praxis, known as the propaganda of the deed, which I will cover some of later. Leftists never held enough sway in the American populace to cause a revolution, and the violence they perpetrated always paled in comparison to the violence perpetrated against them. In this country, capitalism has been far, far, far more harmful because it's been in power. So redbaiting is about ginning up fear about some impending insurrection of subversion that will inaugurate such carnage.
Communism never dies. Communism is a cancer sleeping, awaiting the moment to devour our freedom, to devour democracy. You're thinking this guy's just some right-wing paranoid reactionary who had a horrible upbringing and whose father beat him every day with a Bible. Well, maybe that's true, but it never did me any harm.
This is done to label entire groups of people as detrimental to the well-being of the nation and gain power to eliminate their supposed influence. This ultimately helps suppress consciousness and solidarity about class and any category of people that might be marginalized that leftists are supposedly trying to instigate a revolution on behalf of, thereby preventing their incipient progress. In effect, redbaiting is a type of demagoguery, as in appealing to people's vulgar prejudices for political expediency. It is inherently malicious and downright hateful. You're just a commie defending communist subversion. We have so many documented cases of Soviet spies, labor infiltration, anarchist bomb throwing, Maoist guerrillas, and Antifa riots. Beyond that, The record of Marxists around the world is that of famine, genocide, and misery. Mao Zedong alone is the worst murderer in all of history. Anyone advocating leftism is complicit in this mass killing. Americans are better dead than red.
Raus, Tober des Token ist not a Stickelhauser und der Hausenpfeffer der Fluten. Adolf says it isn't fair.
Funny how your supposed freedom does not apply to leftists, you crypto-fascist.
I think you could say I'm a fascist.
Yeah, I am.
Hey, what up, my Nazi? Oh my God. Hey, what's hanging, my Nazi?
Hail Trump! Hail our people! Hail victory!
Behind! Right in the pool.
The forces of reaction complain endlessly about the big scary red menace, but never look at your own history of famine, genocide, and misery. America eliminated their indigenous population, had to fight a civil war to end their abhorrent practice of slavery, yet still oppress racial minorities, suffers regular recessions, and engages in so many military and clandestine interventions to preserve their declining hegemony. Communists oppose capitalism, fascism, and imperialism, which have killed far more people than leftist countries. You have to resort to lying about subversion in order to demonize the superior system to yours. We will bury you. This episode is not about the efficacy of capitalism or leftism. History has plenty of examples to damn both. That's not the point. If you try to defend your position by going, well, look at the other guy, then you have already lost the argument. If you conflate a massive and disparate group of people as inherently evil, then you are simply propounding bigotry. Crypto is doing red baiting, and Cheka is throwing out red herrings. See what I did there? Everyone to the right of Lenin is not a fascist, and leftists are more than the worst things you can remember about them. Grievance-mongering about how big and evil your opponents are does not make you righteous. Furthermore, both sides are not the same, or whatever denialist nonsense you want to spout. History does not have sides. In order to be a historian, who, after all, are the ones who write history, not victors like so many foolishly repeat, you must apply the historical method, which emphasizes rigorous citation and argumentation. Expectations of being completely unbiased, nonpartisan, or neutral are useless for historians. The idea of objectivity is long dead in the profession, and instead we expect a chameleon-like ability to understand many perspectives and accurately portray them. Perspectives are not sides. They are merely data points to build a more complex context. There's another C, context, along with complexity. You can learn much of these techniques through my historiography videos because the fact is, there are no sides to history. There is a difference between facts and interpretation, of course, but the facts are the facts. I am not here to defend communism. Frankly, madam, I don't give a damn.
So now we'd like to do the top 10 reasons why we're bummed that communism fell in the Soviet Union. It's Wade's world!
The Soviet Union? I thought you guys broke up.
Yes, that's what we wanted you to think.
What Crypto and Cheka said about the horrible occurrences associated with these ideologies is largely true, but both use that to fallaciously persecute a broad swath of people who have nothing to do with those specific atrocities. This is about how red baiting has been used to persecute people throughout American history. While I will be covering some crimes leftists have done, as a necessity of understanding how public fears burgeon, this is about the use of that fear by politicians. While I will have to mention foreign events to understand their effects, this is about American history. Kinda annoying that I even have to make such a clarification, but I've been on the internet long enough to know just how ignorant the average user is.
I've seen things you people wouldn't believe.
I delete or challenge falsehoods and ban bigots. Moderation is necessary to have an actual historical discussion. Without moderation, there is no discussion to be had. But that's why I have Cheka and Crypto to lampshade such stupidity. By the way, if you liked that little bumper at the beginning of this, you can get the graphic on a t-shirt from my merch store, along with many other things, such as this one. Kinda making fun of the fact that my cat's name is King Richard I. But now we can finally get into the long history of red baiting in this country. Since the Revolutionary War, the general American public remained largely faithful to their French allies, but their leadership had steadily withdrawn after Jacobins executed their king in 1793 and instituted a reign of terror. Just a year afterward, President Washington authorized John Jay to make a trade treaty with Britain, basically ending the Franco-American alliance. This began tensions between the countries, causing France to act as though Americans should behave as supplicants. They raided American shipping and demanded bribes for their officials, who were labeled XYZ in diplomatic correspondence. Though bribery was a standard practice in the Old World, the fledgling United States was unwilling to deal with the XYZ affair, beginning what was known as the Quasi-War with France. For 2 years, naval battles between the former allies took place. Federalist Party members held power throughout this conflict, and they were happy to label their opponents, as in the Democratic Republican Party, as Jacobins and therefore traitors. Federalists claimed that Jeffersonians were the high priests of Jacobinism, and their most vocal outlets went to all lengths of profligacy, falsehood, and malignity in defaming the government. Obviously, Thomas Jefferson and others of his party were nothing like that, but they displayed immense affinity to France, and could therefore be said to be trying to institute their own terror in the United States. This first instance of red baiting was exemplary of how the process would happen throughout the rest of American history, save for one aspect. Federalists did not fear some kind of servile insurrection, merely their political subversion. Though they did send weapons to Haiti in their rebellion, so maybe there's a connection there, but Federalists didn't make that. And therefore Federalists did not fear some kind of servile insurrection, merely their political subversion. But that fear was projection, for Federalists sought to subvert the Bill of Rights in order to prevent their opponents' supposed subversion. Projection is often an inherent part of conspiracism. They claim others are conspiring against American values while controverting those very values. Federalists passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, penalizing anyone supposedly uttering seditious speech, raising the difficulty of naturalizing as American citizens, and allowing Frenchmen to be deported as enemies simply for their ethnicity. President Adams quickly signed these bills into law. Federalists immediately applied so-called sedition to anyone vocally opposed to them, especially congressmen. Matthew Lyon was re-elected from prison because of such a conviction. He nearly died due to his cruel jailer. A Supreme Court justice reinforced this sentence and wished he could make it worse, all for having opposed the war. One man received a fine because he remarked upon a negligent musket discharge during a parade, stating, "I wish it fired through Adams's arse." This made it immediately obvious that Federalists weren't actually concerned with Jacobins. The Quasi-War continued and no effort was made to connect supposed subversion with any military action. Federalists simply sought to suppress free speech. After all their complaints about oncoming terror, it was they who terrorized the public, hence why Federalists easily lost the 1800 election. Democratic Republicans, led by President Jefferson, dismantled the oppressive laws, save for one. Immigrants from enemy countries may still be declared forbidden from the United States, a remnant of the first redbaiting this nation participated in. But in several ways, this is very different to our current forms of redbaiting. Class was not a factor, though Congressman Lyon had been an indentured servant before his political ascension. No one spoke of stoking unnecessary class conflict. Most states still had property qualifications for voting, and those were not at stake during the late 1790s. This was not about fearing a new revolution secretly afoot. Jefferson happily labeled his election another revolution, and they were all revolutionaries, given they had just consummated one only a decade prior. But one fundamental aspect of redbaiting was established during this: fear-mongering for the sake of consolidating power. But the United States was not yet capitalist, so leftism didn't really exist yet. That would come in the following years with what historians call the market revolution. Some textile factories had been built prior to 1812, but the war with Britain that began that year necessitated industrial independence. The time following the war became known as the Era of Good Feelings, partially because of Americans' happiness with the outcome of the war and subsequent political tranquility. The Battle of New Orleans, led by General Andrew Jackson, was a substantial victory, and all Americans' war aims had been met with the peace treaty. Furthermore, because of their opposition to the war, Federalists rapidly lost favor, leaving Democratic Republicans as the sole substantial political party. By 1820, James Monroe ran unopposed for president. The North rapidly industrialized throughout this decade and a half. More and more people became wage laborers in mills. These city-dwelling laborers are called proletarians. They were still a minority, and would only become a majority by the end of the century. Most Americans during the market revolution viewed proletarians as less worthy, since they did not own property, and many were women for the sake of lower wages. But it was precisely that aspect that made them a new underclass in which socialists appealed to. Socialists set up numerous communes along the Fourier and Owens models. Intensifying this effort was the religious Great Awakening occurring at the time, which I've covered in other episodes. Christians created numerous communes, from the Oneida Colony to Mormons' United Order. But socialism and communism were largely peripheral during this period. Instead, governments prioritized building roads and canals to take advantage of this burgeoning economy, interconnecting the cash crops of the South with manufacturing in the North. This gave greater access to the abundant natural resources conquered through westward expansion. Markets grew throughout this period, creating a feedback loop that allowed America to overtake all other economies by the end of the century. Historians argue about when the USA became capitalist, but it happened sometime during the first half of the 19th century. Eventually, steam engines accelerated that process, but only after the era of good feelings came to an end. Andrew Jackson was deeply suspicious of the banks that powered this market revolution. He despised the high tariffs that these infrastructure improvements necessitated. Income tax didn't exist yet. But he also wanted to continue the territorial expansion and ensure his riches that were created by his large slave plantation in Tennessee, a recently conquered territory. He wanted all Indians removed west of the Mississippi to ensure further conquest. The Democratic-Republican establishment prevented his rise through parliamentary maneuvering in 1824, but couldn't suppress Jackson's popularity, and he won in 1828. He swore to help regular white men vote, even if they were proletarians. Hence why his breakaway party labeled themselves the Democratic Party. An opposition party, called the Whigs, kept the promise of infrastructure growth through tariffs, despite Democrats' assault on what they called the American system. The era of good feelings ended with this second party system. It would also see the rise of redbaiting as we know it, but not on an issue that either party aligned with. Advocacy for the abolition of slavery had a long history. Northern states steadily did so throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries. But these were local concerns which saw slavery as necessary for their financial success. The South depended on slavery for their cash crop plantations. As the British abolitionist movement grew in momentum toward the end of the era of good feelings, so too did American abolitionism. Britain would abolish theirs in 1833. By then, leading luminary William Lloyd Garrison created the Liberator, and a distinct movement from the North. Buoyed by the British, he headed a letter-writing campaign to send the message of slavery's immorality to the South. Jackson's Postmaster General blocked it, arguing, "The practicable remedy for evil was obedience to the laws of their own state, which forbids the circulation of seditionary papers." After much abolitionist agitation, the House of Representatives instituted a gag rule a year later, shelving any petitions about slavery until 1844. A conspiracy theory grew around abolitionists, arguing that they sought to cause a servile insurrection, and that by tolerating reproduction of their messages, they would cause such an insurrection. Pro-slavery advocates' example was Haiti, who had a series of slave revolts in the 1790s, which gained a temporary abolition for French possessions, at least until Napoleon reinstituted slavery. He sent troops to conquer Haiti and failed, even selling the vast Louisiana territory to the United States due to his dejection over creating a transatlantic empire. After that failed, Haitians massacred Frenchmen throughout their portion of the island, taking bloody vengeance for their slavery. Many families fled this genocide with horrific tales of the carnage. Learning of this, the largest slave rebellion in American history took place on the German coast of Louisiana, and even threatened New Orleans, which was eventually defeated with nearly 100 dead rebels. Precisely when the abolition movement accelerated, Nat Turner's rebellion in southern Virginia took place, which I've covered elsewhere. Southerners were quick to associate abolitionism with stoking slave rebellion, with the eventual goal of white genocide, akin to Haiti. An exemplary open letter clearly associated fears of Jacobin terror and white genocide, writing, "Our Negroes are truly the Jacobins of the country, that they are the anarchists and the domestic enemy, the common enemy of civilized society, and the barbarians who would, if they could, become the destroyers of our race." The lesson of Saint-Domingue, Haiti's original name, tells us that an attempt by the general government to emancipate our slaves would not only threaten to deprive us of a large part of our property, it would also produce immediate danger of the massacre of our families, and of a horrid servile war. Of course, there would be no rebellion of that size again, but the fear of it was enough to denounce abolitionism as too revolutionary. Some even invoked socialism as something trying to institute servile insurrection. Pro-slavery activist James Henley Thornwell argued, "Abolitionism is a series of madness, a hot, boiling, furious fanaticism, destroying all energy of the mind and symmetry of character, leaving its victim, like the blasted oak, a specter of fear and of dread." This dude just called abolition a woke mind virus. Some things about reactionaries never change.
Go to the church and ask God to forgive you.
It is only a single aspect, a special direction of mania, a particular form of a general spirit of socialism, teetotalism, oh no, they're not getting drunk, teetotalism, and perfectionism that are all great diseases. This accelerated after the Mexican-American War, when the argument over what Western territories slavery could expand into animated the sectional crisis, something which I have multiple episodes on as well. Arriving perfectly on time with that were refugees from European revolutions, known as 48ers. Many were explicitly leftists, who aligned themselves with abolitionists. Fighting over slavery in Bleeding Kansas and at Harper's Ferry only seemed to confirm fears of some kind of oncoming insurrection. This became redbaiting fodder for pro-slavery activists. As Whigs split over the slavery issue, the Republican Party arose in stark opposition to slavery's expansion. It was the first successful sectional party and inaugurated the third-party system. A political movement called the Wide Awakes campaigned on behalf of Abraham Lincoln, specifying that they were primarily in favor of free soil, free labor, and free men. In response to Republicans' leftist sympathies, Thornwell claimed, "The parties in this conflict are not merely abolitionists and slaveholders. They are atheists, communists, red Republicans, Jacobins on the other side, and the friends of order and regulated freedom on the other." Uh-oh, Republicans went too woke and didn't go broke because they won the 1860 election. I guess the Wide Awakes went all the way to bespoke, and all the red-baiting pro-slavery activists like Thornwell went broke because they didn't go woke. Womp womp. Southerners attempted leaving the Union because they lost and were big mad, but the Union is perpetual, as our first Constitution states, and the current one makes more perfect. The Civil War led to the abolition of slavery.
The more you fuck around, the more you're gonna find out.
Karl Marx adored this, and wrote to Lincoln on behalf of the First International, stating, "The working men of Europe feel sure that, as the American War of Independence initiated a new era of ascendancy for the middle class, so the American anti-slavery war will do for the working classes. They consider it an earnest of the epoch to come that it fell to the lot of Abraham Lincoln, the single-minded son of the working class, to lead his country through the matchless struggle for the rescue of an enchained race and the reconstruction of a social world." Lincoln responded stating, "The government of the United States has a clear consciousness that its policy neither is nor could be reactionary. It strives to do equal and exact justice to all states and to all men." The luminary and ideologue of the Republican Party, Horace Greeley, had employed Karl Marx for a time, publishing over 500 articles from him and Engels, so there were deep connections between leftism and Republicans at the time. I guess Thornwell's fear of socialism was embodied in Lincoln after all. Unfortunately, Lincoln did not get to steer the postbellum Reconstruction. His assassination emplaced a conservative who would prevent radicals from ensuring equality. Southerners attempted to crack down on freed people, instituting black codes and massacring demonstrators, essentially trying to reinstate slavery in all but name. Congressional Republicans managed to wrest control of Reconstruction from President Johnson and even impeach him, coming within a vote of conviction. But with such turmoil and everyone so beleaguered by the Civil War, protecting civil rights was too deep a cost for most Northerners, and white Southerners would use redbait to prevent that possibility. They demeaned radicalism as having supposedly been imposed on the South to implement the ever-feared servile insurrection. If free men were allowed equality, the fear was that they'd either implement a Haitian-style revolution or intermix the white race out of existence through miscegenation. This conspiracy theory was, of course, a hateful excuse to suppress civil rights, but it worked. They were called Redeemers because they sought to redeem the South from Reconstruction and reinstitute some semblance of the antebellum order and white supremacy. Redeemers labeled any Northerners coming south as carpetbaggers because they were supposedly abusing the situation for profit. Chief among these scapegoats was 48er Carl Schurz, because of his socialism. Despite him splitting in 1872 from the Republican Party to chair the Liberal Republicans, who opposed radicalism. Yes, the Republican Party was so leftist at this time that 48ers thought President Grant was too extreme for his willingness to use the military to defeat Ku Kluxers. The parties today are very different. Southerners also called any white man who voted Republican a scalawag, because doing so betrayed his race. Redeemers rode at night to terrorize black people. Thousands died, all in the name of defeating radicalism, which was really equality. Anytime a radical called for reinforcing civil rights through further Reconstruction measures, rights which were earned through the carnage of the Civil War, Redeemers and eventually conservatives deemed those speeches waving the bloody shirt. That way, the military enforcement of liberties such as the franchise, equality, and safety from lynching could be recontextualized as laughable governmental overreaches. Never mind the ongoing bloodshed from Redeemers, those darn radicals were the ones going too far. It's literally just this meme. By 1876, Republicans had also surrendered to Redeemers and allowed Reconstruction to lapse, dooming civil rights for a century. Their free labor principles were in the past, and redbaiting played a significant role in that failure. For a deeper dive into the failure of Reconstruction, I did an entire video on that, but redbaiting shifted to labor once Southern Redemption was implemented. Labor unions would be the focus of redbaiting for decades, but they only came to prominence during the postbellum period. There had been labor strikes before the war, often labeled as criminal conspiracies, but they had been very limited. Nonetheless, as early as 1850, prominent conservatives like James Gordon Bennett claimed we need not go far to ascertain who were the wire pullers, and who are now the advocates of this extraordinary attempt to bring up our children in the ways of infidelity by abolishing all religious education in our free schools. It originates with the clique of socialists who are now in our midst, and who have been, for years past, straining every nerve to convert this happy republic into another France, by reordering our institutions according to their wild and impracticable notions, and overturning the existing enlightened order of things in government, religion, and society. That was directed against Horace Greeley. He would often apply the same rhetoric about socialism to abolitionism, making the connection between redbait and scaremongering about servile insurrection quite clear. This set the rhetorical precedent for the next century. They would blame foreign agitators, hell-bent on destroying American principles, in order to implement their leftist ideals. When Germans defeated Napoleon III in 1871, Parisians organized themselves into a commune. It only lasted for a couple months before French troops defeated them in a battle and killed thousands in the process. With such little time to implement anything, wild speculation abounded about how these communards were going to destroy society. It became the scapegoat for accusations of sedition during labor unrest. Americans formed the Working Men's Party in 1876 by merging several smaller organizations, essentially forming the first fully Marxist party within the United States, later renamed the Socialist Labor Party. Alongside that, the Knights of Labor formed in 1869, as a kind of fraternity that campaigned for workers' rights and better conditions. They were open to any kind of employees, so long as they earned a wage. They managed to quickly organize numerous railroad workers across the United States. There had been a long depression for 3 years, and some operators began cutting wages. With rampant corruption and monopolies forming, no one expected robber barons to raise wages. Strikes began in July of 1877 and spread rapidly across the nation. This ground many lines to a halt due to work stoppages. Strikers blocked scabs from crossing picket lines, resulting in many scuffles. Governors began calling in troops to suppress the movement, and even enlisted President Hayes for help. They could point to the presence of the Working Man's Party, despite it only having a few thousand members, as though it was a locus of some seditious conspiracy within this movement. The Chicago Tribune labeled it a Red War, claiming communists had incited riots intending to disrupt the American economy. According to them, the strike wave attempted to implement a servile insurrection through minor acts of vandalism. Anything could be a red plot, and so the government had to suppress the riots or risk being overthrown in this new revolution. Hundreds died in the bloody offensive against strikers. When a series of attacks during coal mine strikes were linked to a group of Irish immigrants, supposedly a conspiracy called the Molly Maguires, newspapers were quick to blame labor activism on a red plot, claiming it would result in anarchy and bloodshed that would approach, if not equal, the communism of Paris. Yet this did not deter laborers from organizing, but many disassociated with leftists, such as the Knights of Labor, which rapidly grew after the railroad strike, hitting 800,000 members in 1886, which was roughly a fifth of the entire American workforce. The association with leftists continued anyways, since redbaiting could destroy them. A demonstration for 8-hour workdays in Chicago's Haymarket Square had someone throw a bomb into the police line, resulting in a shootout that killed 11. Prosecutors blamed the authors of an anarchist newspaper, convicting 8, 4 of whom would be executed, despite the fact that no one could link them to the crime. Their mere existence as anarchists was enough to define them as bomb throwers. Haymarket is what May Day memorializes, but robber barons remembered it for the potential to redbait. Membership in the Knights fell precipitously afterward, and later strikes could always be identified as having an anarchist threat simply because it was for laborers' sake. Skilled unions took its place, with the American Federation of Labor forming just a few months after the Haymarket Affair, which remains the largest umbrella organization in the United States. When a union called a strike to prevent Andrew Carnegie's steelworks from lowering wages in Homestead, Pennsylvania, his henchman, Henry Clay Frick, brought the Pinkertons, setting off a shootout and requiring troops to prevent an uprising. Frick was already a pariah because of his role in the catastrophic breakage of a dam, which caused the Johnstown flood, that killed over 2,200 people. An anarchist shot Frick twice in the neck, but someone prevented more shooting and Frick tackled him despite bleeding profusely. Anarchists would continue with what they called the propaganda of the deed, or direct action. One assassinated President McKinley in 1901 after attending a lecture from the prominent anarchist Emma Goldman, who happened to be the would-be Frick assassin's lover. 4 years later, the Industrial Workers of the World formed. IWW members are called Wobblies. They sought to bring all laborers into one big union. They were somewhat of a syndicalist organization, and so employers would link them with bomb throwers during any kind of agitation. A particularly dogged newspaper doing so was the LA Times. A few unionists sought to demonstrate their contempt for it by bombing their facilities while it was supposed to be empty. Unfortunately, the building wasn't empty, and they ended up killing 21 and injuring more than 100 others. The Times immediately blamed a larger conspiracy, saying, "The cause of labor unionism will hereafter be associated in Los Angeles with thugs, bomb throwers, anarchists, and assassins." The Chamber of Commerce passed a resolution that anarchists must be suppressed. They even declared anyone who was friendly toward the left were complicit in this vaster conspiracy. The perpetrators turned out to not actually be anarchists or Wobblies, but their prosecution attempted to blame the left nonetheless, and connected it to over 100 bombings elsewhere. They may have received help from anarchists in buying dynamite, but the bombers were simply unionists. This allowed employers to require new hires to swear that they'd never join a union, called yellow dog contracts. Capitalists could use atrocities like assassinations and bombings to defeat labor activism. Same thing happened with the bombing of a preparedness organization before the American entry into World War I. That investigation was so ridden with redbait that we will never know who the perpetrators were. These incidents served to justify redbaiting on a local level, combining with other fears surrounding Catholicism and foreigners. So for instance, there was the American Protective Association, founded in the wake of Haymarket, which was a secret society like the Know-Nothings who sought to prevent Catholic and anarchist influence by supporting political campaigns, particularly Republicans. They reached their peak after Homestead and fell apart because of failing to take a substantial position on monetary policy in the late 1890s. In 1891, Texas became the first to declare that believing in anarchism was grounds for removing citizenship, something which many states would follow. In 1903, Congress made anarchists inadmissible, cementing the idea that leftists were somehow un-American. For the most part, efforts to fight leftism were independent of the government. For instance, there was the National Civic Federation, created in 1900. It was kind of voluntary precursor of today's National Labor Relations Board, where unionists and bosses could seek arbitration, but they had the explicit exclusion of any leftists. In order to enforce this, groups like the 1903 Citizens Industrial Alliance created informant networks to spy on labor organizers and report on any red sympathies. Yes, there was an American CIA before the current CIA, and it was explicitly for redbaiting. The structure was all ready for a national purge of leftists. Redbaiting had reached its quintessential form, but it would take a world war to catalyze it to the federal level. Once President Wilson secured a declaration of war in 1917 due to the Zimmerman telegram's revelations, he authorized every stratagem for maintaining public loyalty. He created a propaganda bureau, signed laws that criminalized dissenting speech, organized intelligence divisions in both the military and Bureau of Investigations, and authorized work with vigilante movements. This was the worst violation of free speech in U.S. history, all for maintaining loyalty during the war. Wilson! Sure enough, accusations of disloyalty fell upon leftists, especially anyone attempting a strike during the war. A distinct example came in Bisbee, Arizona. A mine strike could be portrayed as disloyal since it has the potential to disrupt the vital supply of copper for the war effort. But two further factors added suspicion of conspiracy. Bisbee is near the border, where a conflict had been fought to prevent the Mexican Revolution from spilling over into the United States and to take revenge for when it did. Hundreds of Americans had died in that, and troops under General Pershing, who was now the commander of the expedition to Europe, had returned from Sonoma and Chihuahua only a few months prior, after chasing Villistas to prevent them from raiding the USA again. Pancho Villa was no friend of Hispanics in Arizona, nor was he a leftist, but mine operators argued otherwise as a reason to fear their employees rising up, instead of the actual reason of unequal pay due to racism. Adding to this irrationality was the arrival of some wobblies to help organize the strike, which operators could argue was a conspiracy to begin a servile insurrection. Instead of negotiating, the sheriff deputized hundreds to kidnap every miner and deport them on cattle cars to the New Mexican desert, with explicit warnings not to return lest they be lynched. That was no idle threat, as other incidents during the war would prove. American vigilantism sharply increased during the war. Nearly every state had an extrajudicial execution. Germans especially faced lynching for alleged disloyalty, but racial massacres occurred too. In East St. Louis, industrialists brought in black workers to keep an aluminum plant functioning during a mostly white labor strike. Whites attacked blacks at night, evacuating the city of its black population with violence. By some estimates, it was the worst massacre of free black people in U.S. history. 10,000 marched with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in silence down Manhattan to protest this grim event. Wilson, of course, did nothing. He did push through criminal litigation against Buffalo soldiers who mutinied and killed 16 in Houston a month later, executing 19 of them. I reviewed a film about that if you want to know more. Of course, newspapers theorized some kind of servile insurrection was afoot. Vigilante organizations grew from this hysteria. Groups like the American Protective League created networks of informants who cataloged any act of supposed disloyalty. They worked with the Bureau of Investigation, who in turn collaborated with the newly created Military Intelligence Division. This was actionable intelligence once Congress passed the Espionage and Sedition Acts, criminalizing any dissenting speech as though it was a direct threat to the war effort, which the Supreme Court would uphold a couple of years afterward, saying that dissent represented a clear and present danger to recruiting and therefore could be criminalized. Meanwhile, international events determined how redbaiting would go federal after the war. Russia had a revolution in early 1917, but eventually communists overthrew the provisional government. These were the Bolsheviks, ironically translated to majority despite the Mensheviks being the majority of communists who opposed the October Revolution. A few months later, the Bolsheviks signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, ending their participation in the war and relinquishing a huge swath of territory to their former opponents, proving that you can successfully invade Russia during the winter. The British decided to intervene in the Russian Civil War with the excuse of securing munitions donated during their alliance and helping the Czech Legion return home to fight Germany. But they really did not understand what they were doing. Prime Minister Lloyd George stated, "We were, in fact, never dealing with ascertained, or perhaps even ascertainable facts. Russia was a jungle in which no one could say what was within a few yards of him. In any case, nothing could be worse than having no policy, and it was better to proceed resolutely on a wrong hypothesis than go on hesitating as the Allies had been doing." Wilson dutifully adhered to official British reasoning, sending more troops than France and Britain combined, only outsized by Japan. This doomed effort was foolish, and everyone involved despised it. Yet Wilson kept up the pressure into the following year, well after the end of World War I proved that reasoning for the intervention was false. One soldier remembered, "Neither Trotsky nor our government gave us so much as a sign of peace. We were forgotten by our own country, ignored by the one for which we were fighting, and drenched in belligerent blood for a thankless people." From its height in late 1918, literally defeating an assault on Armistice Day, the Allies held more territory in Russia than the Soviets, sometimes even allying with other leftists like social revolutionaries and Mensheviks, but by the end, mostly with liberal Republicans and monarchists. It was a mess. The intervention lost militarily as it sought to pull back and leave the fighting to natives, with Americans leaving the North in mid-1919 and Siberia on April Fool's Day 1920. Despite the public ignorance of Allied troops fighting Soviets in their formative civil war, this was the pretext for America's Great Purge. The fear of a Bolshevik revolution coming to the United States drove the craziest year in our history, known as the First Red Scare. World War I was over in late 1918, but Seattle longshoremen still supplied American troops in Siberia. Their union demanded a pay increase given the continued labor increases, but were denied, so they went on strike. Because of the impropriety of the Russian intervention, other unions joined and essentially shut down the city. Newspapers were quick to associate the general strike with Bolshevism as the first step towards a revolution. This was obviously false, but if it bleeds, it leads. The mayor deputized 2,500 University of Washington students setting up machine gun nests throughout the city, so the strike's general council called an end after only 5 days. While this did not seem different from all the pre-war labor conflicts, after all, troops gunned down at least 20 people in Ludlow, Colorado during a mine strike only 5 years prior, the connection to Bolshevism meant any labor activism would be met with such conspiracism and suppression. After a major war, people wanted to reap the rewards of victory after submitting to the deprivations necessary to win it. More strikes were inevitable. The Red Scare had begun. Hollywood jumped at the chance, releasing Bolshevism on Trial, which was based on a book meant to be the sequel to Birth of a Nation. We discussed that as the first example in the propaganda series, if you want to see how much of redbaiting tropes were already present by the spring of 1919. The AFL had participated in a National War Labor Board to prevent disruptions, but the war was over and new strikes popped up almost every week. The most serious of them were the Boston Police and National Steelworkers in September, both of which had troops called out on strikers and unions dissolved. The United Mine Workers struck in coal mines across the nation, almost halting energy production and eventually succeeding in their demands, but not without the consternation of the press and many claims of Bolshevism. In April and June, a few bombs exploded throughout the nation, and another 30 or so were discovered, including one on Attorney General Palmer's doorstep. Though hilariously, the only person hurt was the bomber himself. An earlier burst of a molasses container caused a flood that killed 21, which Palmer blamed anarchists for, despite it clearly being negligence from its maintainers. Using these explanations, Palmer posited these were evidence of a rampant Bolshevik conspiracy and began rounding up any leftists who weren't native citizens, sweeping up 6,000 people, deporting roughly a tenth of them in what became known as the Soviet Ark. The Senate created the Overman Committee to investigate German subversion, which they turned to supposed Bolshevik subversion by the end of 1918, and continued into June of the following year. The American Protective League helped inform on these and line up natives for sedition prosecution, including the leader of the Socialist Party, Eugene V. Debs, who would run for president from prison in 1920. States passed their own laws criminalizing flying red flags and even de-seating elected officials from the Socialist Party. Inquiries into educators who had any labor or left-leaning sympathies became commonplace, leading to numerous teachers losing their jobs, often with only the most cursory allegations of disloyalty. But worst of this purge were the pogroms against black activism. After the war, returning black soldiers embraced a form of militancy for equal rights called the New Negro. Racists took this as a conspiracy to implement Bolshevism, or more likely, used it as an excuse to oppress black people. A wave of riots and massacres struck every state, often with the supposed intent of preventing or punishing rapes of white women from these new Negroes, an old white supremacist trope.
Hey, where are the white women at?
The entire city of Chicago appeared to become a battlefield, with nightly sniper attacks and firebombings for 2 weeks. Washington, D.C. had 4 nights where vigilantes beat blacks all over the capital city, eventually turning into a series of gunfights.
This is America.
Wilson had to send troops to prevent further violence, but only when it seemed like blacks and their allies may succeed in punishing their persecutors. The rural region of Elaine, Arkansas turned into a horrendous bloodbath, with whites killing a minimum of 100 blacks, and the entire black population was displaced at bayonet point. And this is not to attempt recounting the number of individuals lynched throughout the country. Black people and leftists were lumped into one conspiracy theory, where they were attempting to destroy the country through Bolshevism and miscegenation. All told, thousands died in what's called Red Summer. It was the most violent year since the Civil War, and therefore the nadir of race relations. Jim Crow worsened, and that was thanks to redbaiting. Yet the first Red Scare was very short-lived. I couldn't possibly cover everything that happened. That's generally the case with everything I do. But cutting for brevity's sake is especially egregious. I didn't mention the Treaty of Versailles, League of Nations debate, women's suffrage, prohibition, the White Sox rigging the World Series that year, and Spanish flu. Further redbaiting got omitted too, such as when newspapers labeled proof of Einstein's theory of relativity as Bolshevism in science. Such were the times. Palmer arrayed his forces to prevent a supposed insurrection that was meant to occur on May Day, 1920, but nothing of the sort happened, much to his embarrassment. The Republican candidate for president, Warren G. Harding, won by campaigning for a return to normalcy. The Red Scare was over just as fast as it had begun. Some of the strikes continued into 1920, but they mostly did not receive martial responses. West Virginia's would continue to flare, leading to a shootout in Mattawan and the Mingo Mine War, which culminated in the largest internecine battle after the Civil War in 1921 at Blair Mountain. I once wrote a term paper on that, so maybe I should do an episode on it. Nonetheless, that was after the Red Scare had completed. Same with another anti-black pogrom in Tulsa, Oklahoma that same year. When someone bombed Wall Street around the same time, no wave of persecution resulted. In fact, 2 alleged anarchist robbers, Sacco and Vanzetti, were so poorly prosecuted that they became an international cause célèbre for injustice before their executions. Even though 1919 was over, redbaiting continued to evolve. It had become a national presence through the craziness of the first Red Scare. Any labor and black activism could be demonized as conspiring to incite a servile insurrection or implement policy subversion. But more demographics would be thrown into the red category. The American Legion organized after World War I as a veterans advocacy group, but capitalists dominated it from the beginning, hence why they regularly denounced Bolshevik or Soviet sympathies among returning troops. They marched in front of Wobblies in Centralia, Washington during the first anniversary of the armistice, now Veterans Day. A shootout ensued in front of the Wobbly headquarters, killing 5 of the marchers and wounding many more. Wobblies claimed they were attacked, while many of the marchers, who had after all been the only fatalities, said otherwise. One Wobbly was lynched for this, and several went to prison, seemingly receiving lacking punishment for their killings. This fed into the hysteria of the Red Scare, but legionaries took on a new ethos in response: 100% Americanism. This originally championed to preserve the memories and incidents of our association in the Great War, to inculcate a sense of individual obligation to the community, state, and nation, to combat the autocracy of both the classes and the masses, to make right the master of might, to promote peace and goodwill on earth, to safeguard and transmit to prosperity the principles of justice, freedom, and democracy, to consecrate and sanctify our comradeship by devotion to mutual helpfulness. Comrades? Classes and masses? Sounds awfully commie to me. But Centralia galvanized a red-baiting sentiment, happily fanned by elite officers of the Legion. They claimed syndicalists like Wobblies represented a deeply un-American leftism, and that the true Americans could never support the left. This is the origin of the claim that socialism is somehow incompatible with American values, an unrepresentative Red Scare grievance. So 100% Americanism became a catchphrase for further redbaiting. Anything vaguely leftist? Well, that's un-American. It should be driven out, according to the largest veterans group in the country, even today. Never mind freedom of speech, we've got to enforce Americanism. This is why I never joined the Legion, as well as their denunciation of the Bonus Army in 1932 and their denial of the Montgomery GI Bill. They have an abysmal record of advocating for veterans' rights. This claim that being opposed to labor rights is somehow American was how redbaiting integrated with the long history of Nativism in this country. In order to bargain collectively, a union needs a majority of workers for a particular employer to be members. They often negotiated what's called a closed shop, as in all the employees must be members of that union. Bosses wanted open shops, where they could bring in scabs during a strike, coerce yellow dog contracts, and keep union representation at a minimum to avoid collective bargaining. Open shops systematically reduce wages, increase workloads, and prevent labor solidarity. So just call open shops the American plan, and blame anyone arguing against such practices as not living up to 100% Americanism. Awfully dystopian, right? Well, the author of 1984 made that comparison explicit when he said that the movement partially inspired his novel. The name suggested in 1984 is of course Ingsoc, but in practice, a wide range of choices is open. In the USA, the phrase Americanism, or 100% Americanism, is suitable, and the qualifying adjective is as totalitarian as anyone could wish. So this is quite literally Orwellian, and it was so much worse than a posh Englishman could have known.
Today, it's 1984 all over again. Big Brother's back with an important twist. Prager University are demanding conformity to their values. Hate? Division? According to whom? The answer is obvious. PragerU's videos, conform or die.
Employers often enlisted the Ku Klux Klan to intimidate workers who were organizing. Though there had been a first Klan during the 1860s and early 70s, radicals had defeated them. When the Lost Cause myth gained national stature with one of the most popular movies of all time, namely Birth of a Nation, a new Klan was born that same year. You can learn more about the Lost Cause myth with my video on it or my review of that movie. The second Klan was far more broad of an organization, functioning as more of a fraternity than a terrorist organization. But they still glorified violence against minorities, this time including Catholics and Jews on their enemies list, and they proclaimed themselves as 100% American. Much like the anti-Masonic and Illuminati conspiracy theories posited that these secret societies were attempting to overthrow good order through Jacobins during the French Revolution, a new version blamed Catholics and Jews. Anti-Catholicism was bedrock conspiracism for Americans, that rock being named Plymouth. Preeminent historian Arthur Schlesinger Sr. once remarked, "I regard the prejudice against the Catholic Church as the deepest bias in the history of the American people." Anti-Catholicism animated much of American history, from colonial disenfranchisement and Puritanism to nativism against Irish, Italian, Germanic, and Hispanic immigrants. It had even fueled the 1790s fears of Jacobins. The crosses that Klansmen burned, and their symbolism, was meant to prove their Protestant Christianity was superior to Catholics. Many denied that Catholicism, or anything that doesn't strictly adhere to their dogma, was Christian at all, which is an old form of religious bigotry that is still prevalent. White supremacy against Catholics was nothing new though, but Klansmen's anti-Semitism was. Since the late 19th century, eugenicists had drummed up fears of Jews destroying Western civilization through biological replacement. Madison Grant bemoaned the passing of a great race. The myth of a great replacement begins with American racism, and of course it's tied to redbaiting. Major industrialist Henry Ford printed a Russian imperial fabrication that claimed Zionists were trying to bring down Western civilization through revolution and incipient cultural influence, a fake document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This is where the myth originates that Bolsheviks were a Jewish cabal, and that leftists are always Jews, and that there's a Jewish plot to destroy Western civilization. It's easy to discover anti-Semitism at the root of conspiracism. The mindset of a conspiracy theorist is the mindset of an anti-Semite. Of course, the protocols were plagiarized too, but that's irrelevant. The point is that the Klan could blame Jews for the Red Scare, and therefore persecute them for the sake of implementing the so-called American plan. Labor organizers regularly awoke to the flames of a burning cross in their vicinity. The Klan functioned as a capitalist tool during the 1920s, but bigotry always spreads if unchallenged, or in this case, fully supported by much of the American establishment. The Klan naturally adopted Woodrow Wilson's campaign slogan of America First. It had long been a nativist phrase to designate foreigners as fully alien. With 100% Americanism, the Klan could push for nativist policies by saying,
America First! America First! They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. Build that wall. Build that wall. Build that wall. Build that wall.
How did that get in there? The Klan said the same thing, but were a bit more explicit about the enemy being Jews. Eugenicists across the nation, including Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, had advocated restricting immigration to prevent leftists and non-whites from integrating and therefore miscegenating American society. I spoke about that in my racialization episode. That's why Roosevelt signed the Anti-Anarchist Act, and Wilson signed a bill to deport radicals. Eugenicists' dreams came true in 1921, when Congress restricted general European European immigration for the first time. 3 years later, they enacted a permanent quota that targeted Catholics and Jews. On top of that, the Bureau of Investigation, later to be renamed FBI, continued compiling data on dissidents after Palmer's demise. The detective in charge of the investigation into the LA Times bombing headed the Bureau and was deeply corrupt, and he failed to be extended due to his involvement in the Teapot Dome scandal. His successor was the previous head of the Anti-Radical Division, J. Edgar Hoover. After the past shenanigans, he had a tight leash in prosecuting radicalism. He kept files, as any embittered librarian is apt to do, but he gained new independence when the Bureau of Investigation became the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 1933. Hoover quietly compiled dossiers on dissidents, at first in compliance with the Alien Enemies Act. He had lists of people for future detention during a hypothetical war. The FBI collected everything from actual information to idle gossip, often through illegal wiretapping, all in the name of 100% Americanism. This quickly spread to essentially an enemies list for the state, with all kinds of rumors listed as derogatory information against any individual deemed undesirable by Hoover. He formed a power unto himself through this. This wealth of derogatory information would be incredibly useful for any redbaiter in the future, and Hoover was giddy to help. The culmination of this nativism, welding to redbait, came with the Smith Act of 1940, which required all immigrants to register and that advocating, overthrowing, or destroying any government in the United States could lead to a prison sentence. This even applied to native citizens, despite ostensibly being about foreigners. The Sedition Act had been repealed in late 1920 and clemency offered. The Smith Act had the potential to be abused to suppress free speech by labeling leftism a form of advocating overthrowing the government. But in 1940, it was only about preventing actual violence. Nativism had been successfully conflated with redbait, but another conflation was much more important for the time. The Great Depression was such a tremendous crisis that when Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president, he quickly got a package of legislation passed that targeted the 3 R's of poverty relief, economic recovery, and regulatory reform. This was the New Deal. Though much of the first version would be struck down, the second thrived. If you would like to learn more about what the New Deal entailed, check out my lecture on that. But there was a constant argument among Americans that persists to this day on whether it constituted a simple reform of capitalism or a kind of light socialism. The clear alignment was that it was progressive, but its enemies claimed it would lead to the Sovietization of America. After so much redbaiting in the early 20th century, that was an easy accusation to bandy about, no matter how obviously false it was.
Socialism is when the government does stuff. And it's more socialism the more stuff it does. And if it does a real lot of stuff, it's communism.
Legacies we still have today are Social Security, unemployment insurance, federal guarantees of collective bargaining, work programs, regulation of stock ownership, a 40-hour work week, minimum wage, and deposit insurance. A lot of conservatives despise these things and engaged in redbaiting in order to demonize it. Indeed, redbaiting would ultimately doom the New Deal coalition, but not for decades to come. By the end of FDR's first year, the State Department officially recognized the Soviet Union. This was necessary since they had become an important trade partner during the Depression. Conservatives could claim this signified the New Deal's supposed alignment with communism. They formed a lobbying group called the American Liberty League to combat radicalism because the New Deal flew a flag of varying shades of Bolshevism, socialism, and communism. Newspaper mogul William Randolph Hearst said FDR was the unofficial candidate of the Comintern, which was essentially the Third International, set up specifically by the Soviets. In fact, the American Communist Party expressly opposed the New Deal at first as too much of a band-aid for capitalism during these years. It was true that leftists found the New Deal administration more welcoming, but these accusations of leftism were pure redbait. This transformed redbaiting into a specifically partisan strategy, rather than racist, anti-labor, or nativist. But a new threat would create solidarity between New Dealers and leftists. Fascists took power in 1922 Italy, but were not seen as threatening world peace. But the same year FDR became president, Nazis took power in Germany. Sympathetic fascist organizations began in the United States. William Dudley Pelley formed the Silver Shirts a couple months before Roosevelt's inauguration, and would create the Christian Party to run against his first re-election. Alongside the dregs of the Second Klan, which had been in steep decline since some of its leaders had been convicted of murder and embezzlement, though they had a bit of a resurgence in 1928 to denounce Catholic presidential candidate Al Smith, many of its former adherents turned to fascism, forming early groups like the Black Legion. Catholic evangelist Charles Coughlin preached anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about the New Deal over the radio and published his own journal pushing fascism as an alternative to his lies about FDR's supposedly Jewish socialism. Nazis had the Free Society of Teutonia, reformulated into the Friends of New Germany once Hitler became dictator, and then the German-American Bund as an explicit opposition to the New Deal.
The only thing to fear is me.
During the decade, roughly 100 anti-Semitic organizations were founded combining conservatism with their more extreme fascistic or reactionary tendencies. In all the time beforehand, according to historian Leonard Dinnerstein, there had only been 5 such organizations. Leftists' responses would only embolden such right-wing extremism. Stalin ordered parties affiliated with the Comintern, including CPUSA, to align in solidarity against fascist movements by 1936, which they called the Popular Front, meaning now communists were aligned with FDR. That would only last until Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact in 1939, dividing Poland between themselves. That brief 3-year period enraged conservatives, who responded by forming a coalition in 1937. Reading a manifesto into the Congressional Record, they stated, "In God's name, do not do nothing while America drifts down the inevitable gulf of collectivism. Stand up for the American system of enterprise and the great American principles, which have made enterprise what it is." A year later, Representative Martin Dies began the House on Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, specifically to investigate leftist and fascist sedition. He made numerous accusations, but was unable to support any of them with evidence, basically becoming a place for Dies to rant about how communist all this New Deal stuff was. But that went nowhere. Even though the Nazis and Soviets had aligned to invade Poland, which initiated World War II, that was a pact that could not last. They were natural enemies and Hitler needed Russian oil, so Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941. Just 5 months later, Japan attacked the American Pacific Fleet and the Philippines, bringing the USA into the war. So the Soviet Union was a natural ally, effectively postponing the mini Red Scare that had been building since the beginning of FDR's second term. That would have to wait until after the war. There is much debate about what constitutes the Cold War and when it began. I have an entire episode about the origins of it, covering this dispute, but most can agree it was defined by a rivalry between the United States and Soviet Union following World War II. During World War II, the Allies had several summits to coordinate strategy and arrange the post-war settlement. FDR was a key ingredient of this, yet he died before the end of the war, leaving Harry S. Truman to succeed him. The Potsdam Conference divided Europe into spheres of influence. Capitalist countries believed they should contain communism from spreading further. Greece was the first of many proxy wars between these antagonists. Just a few months later, the Chinese Civil War restarted. Democracy won in Greece and communism in China. Before those could end, Truman declared a doctrine of helping countries fight communism, such as Turkey that faced a Soviet intimidation campaign. America created the Marshall Plan to aid economic recovery in Europe. The Soviets refused this help and instead demanded that Germany not institute their new Deutschmark. East Germany blockaded West Berlin, requiring the airlifting of supplies. To consummate all this strife, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, ending the US monopoly on the weapon and eventually causing much fear of nuclear annihilation. For many Americans, these events evinced a failure to prevent the spread of communism, so they fell back on pre-war accusations of being too sympathetic to leftism. They claimed that the advance of Soviet power and influence was because Truman was soft on communism. This allegation was particularly troublesome because the president had his own domestic legislative agenda to improve upon the New Deal called the Fair Deal, so conservatives could block the agenda with Redbait, which was the motivation behind a whole new Red Scare. Another war labor board prevented agitation, but afterward, a strike wave swept the country. A slight recession hit as a consequence of the war, causing much consternation. HUAC had been made a standing committee in January of 1945 and now had a reason to investigate Soviet influence in the unions on strike. Of particular interest was the movie industry. Plenty of Hollywood personalities happily testified about their petty resentments and conspiracy theories regarding leftists. Many were members of a group called the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, some of whom named names of alleged leftists poisoning the industry. There had been a few pro-Soviet films made as a consequence of wartime propaganda. One member, Ayn Rand, went so far as to write an unhinged guideline decrying their purpose is corrupting our moral premises by corrupting non-political movies, by introducing small, casual bits of propaganda into innocent stories, thus making people absorb the basic premises of collectivism by indirection and implication. This was essentially echoing Pelley's and Ford's anti-Semitic screeds against Hollywood, but simply replacing the word Jew with communists. A trope regularly repeated when conspiracists complain about some kind of ideology infecting media, be it liberal bias, political correctness, or woke. There's no such thing as apolitical stories, but the idea that the industry has an insidious message to sell, especially one opposed to excessive profits, is beyond credulity, and hilariously lacking any understanding of how movies are made. Remember, you'll find anti-Semitism at the root of most conspiracism. 10 Hollywood insiders that were named appeared before the committee, but solely to protest HUAC's anti-free speech, and then pled their Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. Congress held them in contempt. Hollywood blacklisted them from the industry. That blacklist would expand rapidly to include hundreds, some of whom would take their own lives as a result. There would be entire journals dedicated to defaming supposed radicals and propagating rumors, most famous of which was Red Channels. HUAC continued to do the same for other industries, but legislation was more important. Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act, which directly attacked labor activism. It outlawed sympathetic and general strikes for NLRB-recognized unions, and removed recognition for anyone with leadership identified as too leftist. States could also pass so-called right-to-work laws, dismantling union shops, or as capitalists preferred to call it, the American Plan. It was the first of many blows to the American labor movement that would eventually destroy it. HUAC shifted to spy hunting when an informant named Elizabeth Bentley testified about several secret communists who had passed information to the Soviets. This revealed journalist Whittaker Chambers, who named members of the Ware Group, a CPUSA spy ring in DC during the New Deal. Most were low-level employees who were no longer part of the government, save for one possible member, Alger Hiss, who had become a prominent State Department bureaucrat involved in the creation of the United Nations. Chambers never claimed that Hiss had done anything with the Ware Group after the mid-1930s, meaning espionage charges were too late, but HUAC could get him for perjury when he denied the allegations. The representative who pursued this most vigorously was Richard Nixon. This was perfect for driving a wedge between the Democratic administration and Republican candidates. There were also plenty of spies in the Manhattan Project, especially among atomic scientists. And American intelligence officers were aware of some of these. From 1942 to 48, the FBI tapped coded Soviet messages, though it took many years to decrypt everything and risked revealing the program. These Venona Project dispatches did reveal that atomic spies existed. Partly to stave off criticism of being soft on communism, Truman created a loyalty program for testing federal employees. People could be fired for leftist sympathies. The FBI collected any gossip and continued compiling dossiers on anyone with derogatory information. They made a list of subversive organizations. And Truman gained re-election in 1948. Republicans had avoided redbaiting about Truman during that election, even though the splitters from his own party did. Conservative Democrats formed the Dixiecrats in opposition to what they called communism, which was Truman ordering the military to desegregate. They failed to remove Truman, but Republicans learned that redbaiting would serve them well in the next election. The following year, the FBI arrested the leadership of the Communist Party under violations of the Smith Act. The trial turned into a circus, especially since none had expressly advocated for the violent overthrow of the US government, but Hoover claimed that communism itself was that alone. A blatant misinterpretation, but one that was successful in court. Hiss also got convicted for perjury. They caught a minor spy named Judith Copeland working for the Department of Justice. Because the prosecution refused to reveal the Venona Project, Judge Learned Hand granted an appeal and threw out the evidence as poisoned, stating, "Few weapons in the arsenal of freedom are more useful than the power to compel a government to disclose the evidence on which it seeks to forfeit the liberty of its citizens. All governments, democracies, as well as autocracies, believe that those they seek to punish are guilty. The impediment of constitutional barriers are galling to all governments when they prevent the consummation of that just purpose. But those barriers were devised and are precious because they prevent that purpose and its pursuit from passing unchallenged by the accused, and unpurged by the alembic of public scrutiny and public criticism. A society which has come to wince at such exposure of the methods by which it seeks to impose its will upon its members has already lost the feel of freedom and is on the path towards absolutism." Funny how we're still having a debate right now about whether it's right to give due process to accused people. Here's Learned Hand 70 years ago saying that is fascism. Redbaiting threatens liberty by pretending to protect it, as the most high-profile spy case would reveal. The British caught atomic spy Klaus Fuchs, even though MI6 was fatally compromised by double agents. Fuchs revealed courier Harriet Gold, who revealed David Greenglass, who then revealed his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg, who denied the charges. Greenglass in turn revealed that his sister and Julius's wife, Ethel, had helped in the scheme. As a threat to Julius, she was also charged. Both got convicted and the judge imposed the death penalty for both of them. Most historians consider the execution of Ethel as a travesty, one of the many excesses of the times, but not the worst.
House lodging, get that communist Joe.
Joe McCarthy came to the Senate on a bit of a fluke and already had a sordid career as a terrible judge. He was a conservative, but switched from Democrat to Republican to defeat young Bob La Follette in the Republican primary, which was quite the upset, but then did little initially as a freshman senator. He took a bribe to write a book and endorse Pepsi Soda, advocated on behalf of Nazi war criminals, and supported the Taft-Hartley Act. He needed to regain popularity. After a campaign dinner in Wheeling, West Virginia, he offhandedly claimed to have a list of communists in the State Department. He would change the number in later speeches, but the initial 205 figure came from a 1947 letter from Secretary of State Burns stating that the loyalty tests had discovered 285 personnel with derogatory information on them and already removed 70 of them. Only 60 of them were still in the State Department by 1950 because the info on them wasn't actionable or significant. This did not specify what the derogatory information was, but in the hands of a demagogue, it was golden redbait. McCarthy kept making such claims but refused to provide evidence. People called his office to express support or even offer their own conspiracy theories, which he would echo in further accusations. He'd call this network of informants his loyal American underground. He became so shrill that senators chose to put the allegations to the test with an investigative committee chaired by Millard Tydings. McCarthy provided a few names, none of whom were communists, instead diverting attention to the claim that Democrats were refusing to deal with him. This should have disgraced McCarthy, but he found another pivot: homophobia. Just a couple months into the Tydings Committee, he went to the floor of the Senate to claim that gay men were an inherent security risk that should be treated as if they were in the thrall of communism, because they could be blackmailed since sodomy was still a crime. He didn't demonize other such crimes as being open to blackmail, because this was obvious bigotry. This lavender scare, as it's often designated, was yet another deflection, but Truman allowed it to persecute gays out of the government. Several people committed suicide because of this. Later, one McCarthy opponent in the Senate had a son caught for soliciting an undercover officer, which then McCarthy used to blackmail Senator Lester Hunt, who decided to take his own life instead of subjecting his son to this trauma. By the end of 1950, journalists called these constant accusations and swings away from accountability McCarthyism, because it was an effective deflection from his political deficiencies. What happened next that year was only fuel for the fire. Less than a month from McCarthy's infamous Lavender speech, North Korea invaded South Korea, violating the existing treaty. South Korea almost immediately seemed like it would lose badly, requiring American intervention, which was a decisive change, beating back North Korea, at least until China intervened, overwhelming American firepower with sheer numbers. That is the reason why the Claymore mine exists. The Korean War ended up in a stalemate for 2 years, but it was largely just another proxy war, this time with horrendous stakes. General MacArthur had thoughtlessly proposed usage of nuclear weapons after advocating invading China. These were obvious strategic indiscretions, but his advocacy of Republican candidates in the midterm was enough to oust him from command. Truman relieved him in April of 1951. McCarthy could now claim that Democrats were trying to destroy American hegemony in Asia. After all, the Marshall Plan had put money to allies for their ability to compete against American manufacturing, and the China hands had lost the country to communism. McCarthy could claim that Democrats wanted to destroy America through their soft-on-communism position, which came in handy during the presidential election of 1952. Republican candidate and former five-star general Dwight D. Eisenhower was dismayed by McCarthy's redbaiting against his friend George Marshall, but didn't have the bravery to face McCarthyism like he had only a decade prior with a similar enemy.
Scandalous!
Eisenhower chose to bide his time. He couldn't oppose the obvious demagogue because that would have hurt him politically, despite aligning with the liberals of his party rather than the conservatives like McCarthy. But McCarthy himself won re-election, and Republicans gave him a key position on the United States Senate Committee on Governmental Affairs, which allowed him access to the Subcommittee on Investigation. Effectively now, McCarthy could investigate his own wild speculation. Senator Pat McCarran proposed legislation that helped McCarthyism. For instance, he had passed the Internal Security Act over Truman's veto, which required communists to register with the federal government. He went so far as to outlaw the Communist Party and anyone affiliated with it once McCarthy gained power. In a very real way, McCarran was the power behind the red-baiting throne. But McCarthy was far more impulsive than McCarran. As he proved with his initial independent hearings, his first target was the Voice of America, a NATO propaganda outlet that broadcast across the Iron Curtain and often served as an independent source of news for Eastern Europeans. The VOA held libraries throughout Europe, including books that McCarthy designated as too subversive for his fragile disposition, claiming this was evidence of a vast commie conspiracy. They had to literally burn numerous volumes to conform with his hatred. Regardless of the usefulness of being able to read opposition media, he could disparage the VOA as contaminating American politics, even though their sole purpose was to appeal to people under communist control. McCarthy held numerous hearings where he'd pester witnesses to name names. The main lawyer that McCarthy used for investigations and counsel was Roy Cohn, who had been involved in the Rosenberg trial. He had David Schein as an assistant, the son of a hotel fortune and rabid anti-communist. They were likely lovers, though McCarthy always looked the other way. After traipsing about Europe, censoring libraries, Schein returned to get drafted into the army. Cohn tried to get every privilege for Schein. Meanwhile, McCarthy found an army dentist who had been a member of the American Labor Party, so he made a big deal out of that man's promotion. He berated a general so profanely that Eisenhower ordered officers to no longer testify. A showdown was necessary. A set of hearings between Army lawyer Joseph Welch and McCarthy was set up to be televised and chaired by Senator Carl Mundt. McCarthy interrupted so much with points of order that it became an ongoing joke. One accusation after another failed, but McCarthy simply pivoted with every disproof. Anything in the name of defeating communism. It was high melodrama for over a month. Prominent newscaster Edward R. Murrow personally financed a special on McCarthy, exposing his constant bullying and ugly demeanor. Most Americans had not seen this for themselves. Murrow concluded, "The line between investigation and persecuting is a very fine one, and the junior senator from Wisconsin has stepped over it repeatedly. His primary achievement has been in confusing the public mind as between the internal and external threats of communism. We must not confuse dissent with disloyalty. We must remember, always, that accusation is not proof, and that conviction depends upon evidence and due process of law. The actions of the junior senator from Wisconsin have caused alarm and dismay amongst our allies abroad, and given considerable comfort to our enemies. And whose fault is that? Not really his. He didn't create the situation of fear, he merely exploited it, and rather successfully. Cassius was right. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. Good night, and good luck."
Good night, and good luck.
The facade of red baiting was slipping, but the climax of the Army McCarthy hearings came when McCarthy attacked one of Welch's aides, because he had been a member of a lawyer association with leftist leaders, when that aide had just begun professionally. He was supposedly trying to defend Cohn from an innuendo about Schein, but rather than counterattacking, Welch simply asked to drop the topic, because both were well aware of it and how little that mattered. He said,
"Till this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness. If it were in my power to forgive you for your reckless cruelty, I would do so."
Senator, may we not drop this? I did you, I think, no personal injury, Mr. Cohn.
No, sir.
And if I did, I beg your pardon. Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
You could see everyone realize this was a slam dunk in real time. Just look at that lady gape in awe. Murrow had made Americans ready to spot the bullying, and Welch nailed him. McCarthy could not recover from this. The Senate convened a committee chaired by Arthur Watkins to decide what to do about McCarthy's shenanigans. Wisconsinites gathered over 80% of signatures required to recall him in a campaign called Joe Must Go. The Watkins Committee advised the Senate to pass a resolution condemning McCarthy's bullying, which passed with ease. It stated, "McCarthy acted contrary to senatorial ethics and tended to bring the Senate into dishonor and disrepute, to obstruct the constitutional processes of the Senate, and to impair its dignity, and such conduct is hereby condemned." It did not use the word censure, but it was effectively that. No one wanted to associate with McCarthy. Ike even quipped that it's no longer McCarthyism, it's McCarthyism. McCarthy had been a horrendous alcoholic, often getting openly sloshed during hearings. He had a terrible ulcer that he poorly treated and began taking drugs. He lasted merely a year and a half before succumbing to his depression. It may have been McCarthyism by the end of 1954, but redbaiting persisted. Historians normally mark this as the end of the Second Red Scare, but HUAC continued for more than a decade afterward. Ike amplified loyalty testing.
You don't think? By the way it's looking, Dwight, I'd say he's a dirty, oh god, collectivizing, no, commie. Commie! Commie! Yeah, go get him, Dwight.
And the Cold War was to reach its apogee with the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963, where still, redbaiting took a distinctly worse turn, as conspiracists realized they were no longer welcome. They became outsiders for half a decade and would use the lingering fear of a red menace to fight civil rights. Just a week after the Murrow Report was broadcast, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that segregated schools were unconstitutional, repudiating the old standard of separate but equal. Schools were required to integrate, which was a complex process that I covered in the Attacks on Education episode. Immediately, racists claimed SCOTUS was now pinko, as in slightly red, and therefore trying to destroy the United States from within. That's why protesters held signs reading, "Race mixing is communism." Higher education has always been a target for redbaiters, especially since there tends to be more leftists in academia, largely due to their studies and the radicalism of being a young adult. The American Legion printed accusation after accusation of commie indoctrination. They had already passed a resolution stating, "It devolves upon the teachers of civics and United States history to explain clearly and impartially that differences between our Republican form of government in a democracy and the communist dictatorship. Yet in that explanation, our system must not suffer but be exalted." So any deviation from this mandatory triumphalism could be seen as trying to implement communism. A third iteration of the Ku Klux Klan revived itself to fight for America first. Citizen councils formed in order to fight integration. They declared in their inaugural issue that the NAACP, which had argued Brown v. Board, was a vehicle for communism. They could use this redbait to organize segregation academies that skirted the law into the 1980s. As the civil rights movement developed in the late 1950s and early 60s, segregationists regularly made such an association, saying that equality was a commie plot to destroy the United States with forced diversity.
Now a victim of the very communist agitation he had helped promote, Medgar Evers was able to further serve communist purposes by being glorified as a martyr in the supposed fight of the Negro people for freedom and justice.
Many leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois and Martin Luther King had leftist sympathies, and protests regularly campaigned on behalf of all working-class people. Citizen councils used this to spread hatred and fear. When George Wallace became governor of Alabama in 1963, he said, "In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny. I say, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever." A group of men on the Supreme Court had admittedly belonged to as many as 100 communist front organizations, but we warn those of any group who would follow the false doctrine of communist amalgamation that we will not surrender our system of government, our freedom of race and religion. By conflating equality with communism, segregationists could demonize civil rights, attempting to do the same thing they had done during Reconstruction. They would fail, but the technique of redbaiting remained a way to hide segregationist intent, which culminated with the creation of the Southern Strategy in 1964. Republican candidate Barry Goldwater had voted against the Civil Rights Act of that year. He received the nomination saying,
"The good Lord raised this mighty republic to be a home for the brave and to flourish as the land of the free, not to stagnate in the swampland of collectivism, not to cringe before the bullying of communism."
All along, the term states' rights was a dog whistle for segregationists, just as Confederates had used it for the sake of slavery a century before.
But when the people do protest, they get only one answer: put the lid on it. This has nothing to do with civil liberties, it's a voting gimmick. Justice becomes a sick joke. Illegitimate births swell the relief rolls. Juvenile delinquency becomes a way of life. The people look to the old dream of what it used to mean to be an American. Even the voices of the leaders begging peace are no longer heard. New America, gone wrong. Lost our leadership, lost our way.
It's in your hands, America.
Oh my goodness. Here, Goldwater strategically employed it to gain votes in the South, saying, "Those who seek to live your lives for you, to take your liberty in return for relieving you of yours, those who elevate the state and downgrade the citizen, must see, ultimately, a world in which earthly power can be substituted for divine will. Our towns and our cities, then our counties, then our states, then our regional compacts, and only then, the national government. That, let me remind you, is the ladder of liberty, built by decentralized power." Nonetheless, Goldwater lost the election, though he managed to get the Deep South, except for Texas and Florida, thereby showing a possible avenue for Republicans, who had been losing ground for decades. Nixon would use the Southern strategy to tremendous effect in the following election.
Let us recognize that the first civil right of every American is to be free from domestic violence.
Though Wallace took the Deep South in 1968 with a third party, Nixon's 1972 re-election was a major landslide, taking the entire South, a first for the Republican Party. And while he did much to push the strategy, redbaiting had already taken a different tact, following the popularity of a conspiracist group that came to prominence alongside Goldwater.
Join the John Birch Society, help us fill the ranks. To get this movement started, we need lots of tools and cranks.
The John Birch Society, or simply Birchers, formed in 1958 with the express purpose of fighting some domestic plot that was supposedly already underway. They essentially took McCarthyism and smashed it together with the conspiracy theory that drove Nazism, as in the stab in the back myth, but in a new form. Nazis had updated the hoax that was the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and applied that to their own national humiliation. Hitler claimed, "The whole of war production was under Jewish control, while the Jew robbed the whole nation and pressed it beneath his domination, and agitation was carried on against the Prussians. Sailors arrived in trucks and proclaimed the revolution. A few Jewish youths were the leaders in this struggle. They raised the red flag in the homeland. In these nights, hatred grew in me, hatred for those responsible for this deed. The Kaiser held out a conciliatory hand to the leaders of Marxism, without suspecting that the scoundrels have no honor. While they still held the imperial hand in theirs, their other hand was reaching for the dagger. There's no making pacts with Jews. There can only be the hard either or. I, for one, decided to go into politics." Well, he did, declaring the American eugenics book, Passing of the Great Race, as his Bible. He praised Ford's anti-Semitism, writing, "Every year makes Jews more and more the controlling masters of the producers in a nation of 120 millions. Only the single great man, Ford, to their fury, still maintains full independence. Ford received the Order of Merit of the German Eagle for publishing the fabricated protocols. American redbaiting significantly influenced the stab-in-the-back myth, and therefore the rise of Nazism. Since they claimed communists were crypto-Jews, an obvious falsehood which I've covered elsewhere, they used this to attack what they called cultural Bolshevism, which supposedly belittled traditional patriotism in order to institute communism. Nazis attacked the Institute for Social Research at the University of Frankfurt for driving division and being somehow too critical, eventually propelling some of its members to take refuge in the United States. This is where the term cultural Marxism comes from, a defunct Nazi conspiracy theory. It is distinctly anti-Semitic, violent, and ignorant, but a great way to redbait, which the Birchers latched onto. They would speculate about the most wild ideas of communist subversion. Founder and wannabe dictator Robert Welch believed that even Ike was a commie. To his acolytes, the United Nations was a pinko plot to institute one world government by international Jewry. Oh, I can't use that term. Better call them globalists instead. They really thought that the USA had been stabbed in the back by the USSR through subversion. As such, Birchers tried to prevent negotiations with Soviets through their advocacy group Committee Against Summit Entanglements, or CASE, which both candidate Goldwater and conservative leader William F. Buckley took part in. Republicans prominently placed many members within Goldwater's campaign. But after that failure, Buckley renounced Birchers as too fringe, but never did much to remove their bigotry from his movement. The cultural Marxism conspiracy theory became mainstream within conservative circles, especially as the New Left arose. Throughout the 1960s, young people fought against discrimination, the Vietnam War, and conformity. This was the counterculture. They took inspiration from the old left to create a new one, emphasizing peace and justice rather than class struggle. Some of their influences were the old Nazi targets of the Frankfurt School, a group of mostly Jewish academics who argued that popular media helped bolster capitalism by making the population complacent and docile. Their critical theory analyzed popular media for how it reinforced societal structures. For Nazis, this was evidence of the Protocols of Zion, which, reminder, was a hoax to begin with. Herbert Marcuse was one of them and a huge influence on the New Left. Birchers alleged that the counterculture was a Marxist plot to overthrow the United States through incipient cultural influence. Nazis called it cultural Bolshevism, Birchers called it cultural Marxism. But it was the same old hatred. Anything perceived as anti-patriotic was now part of this entire scheme. They could even bring back the Wilsonian canard of equating dissent with sedition, now with the conspiracy theory of globalist cultural Marxism. All those commie-controlled colleges were somehow brainwashing the youth by teaching them to think for themselves. And we can't have people who don't conform to white supremacy in this country. So said Klansmen, legionaries, and now Birchers. The most prominent argument of this sort was the 1964 book None Dare Call It Treason, which spun an elaborate tale of elites supposedly trying to betray the United States for the sake of communism. 4 years later, the author even tried to directly tie it with the Lost Cause and evangelical Christianity with his sequel, The Death of a Nation, a clear allusion to the birth of a nation, which the book fabricated further, saying these pro-communist elites were actually enthralled to the Antichrist, here to destroy the United States through membership in the United Nations. Such insane Bircher nonsense was a bestseller and continues to be a driving conspiracy theory among the right wing.
You son of a bitch.
I'm Dinesh D'Souza.
Oops. That's the stupidest combination I ever heard in my life!
Birchers even had a disconnected militant arm called the Minutemen, a far-right paramilitary group with over 10,000 members, who practiced guerrilla warfare to eventually become an insurgency against the supposedly communist-controlled government. Some even started dipping into the even further right conspiracy theory of a Zionist-occupied government, because they equated communism with Judaism. Some members even committed a few bombings, and would have a foundational presence for other white supremacist terror groups. Birchers continued much of the racist conspiracism from the McCarthyite era. They produced a propaganda film in 1966 claiming that the civil rights movement was part of this conspiracy theory.
The civil rights movement, as we know it today, is simply part of a worldwide movement organized and directed by communists to enslave all mankind.
We watched it as part of our propaganda series, so be sure to tune in for that. When the Democratic National Convention of 1968 was overshadowed by protests against the Vietnam War, Chicago police violently suppressed them. A victorious Republican Party
Nixon's back!
A victorious Republican Party decided to make examples of this supposed commie plot by putting on a show trial of some organizers. The zoo that followed only deepened the unfounded imaginings of Birchers and their supporters, even though the defendants were acquitted and their contempt convictions eventually overruled. I covered that in a previous episode too. Someone who affiliated with Birchers, but was never officially a member, brought this conspiracism to the mainstream. Phyllis Schlafly fought against the Equal Rights Amendment, which stated, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." Schlafly launched the Eagle Forum to stop equality. The second newspaper available boasts about an anti-communist conference supporting her cause. She regularly called feminists commies. She claimed that the ERA was a leftist plot to destroy family values, thereby bringing about the destruction of Western civilization. She could pretend to be reasonable during a debate and very concerned about what equality would mean for families, and then use the Bircher nonsense about cultural Marxism to gin up fears about the new left. Any redbait was allowable as long as it defeated equality. And it was effective, for not enough states ratified the amendment before its expiration date. Redbaiting with the old Nazi conspiracism was successful. Birchers were defunct, but their ideology had gone mainstream, especially once Ronald Reagan became president. Now, I've done an episode covering Ronald Wilson Reagan. He had made a career of redbaiting, from his first appearance in Congress before HUAC, to making anti-communist propaganda after he got dropped by General Electric. His Goldwater Choice speech made it seem like LBJ would communize the United States. He sicked police on hippies, expressly citing leftism as a good reason for the violence, and finally ran for president because he hated détente with the Soviets that would supposedly cause the Reds to invade through the cultural Marxists who were using the welfare system to make everyone submit to the state. He labeled that a very perverse Marxian redistribution of income amongst the poor. He always used redbaiting to push his neoliberal agenda. He assailed the American Civil Liberties Union as communist sympathizers. When he helped segregation academies, he touted free enterprise. When he used the Southern strategy, he advocated against the state. His famous joke,
"I've always felt the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, 'I'm from the government and I'm here to help.'"
That was pure redbaiting in order to deregulate corporations. He even invoked Bircher and Nazi nonsense about cultural Bolshevism when denying the legitimacy of historians and claiming that Howard Zinn represented the entire field. He merely incorporated all previous redbait, but he was the first president to make it an integral part of his entire rhetoric. Ever since then, Republicans and sometimes even Democrats have utilized this long tradition of bigotry. After this immensely long episode, the pattern should be fairly obvious. Schlafly was the last to innovate. Anyone invoking the specter of servile insurrection is simply repainting the same color of red they've been painting the nation with for decades. After all this history, it should be an obvious grift. But what is particularly nefarious about redbaiting is that reactionaries constantly reinvent their hatred with fresh coats of red paint. The bullshit behind the Protocols of Zion hoax is the same as cultural Marxism, whatever direction your anti-Semitism likes to dog whistle. We saw right-wingers revive the conspiracy theory about political correctness in the 1990s. Here's a propaganda film pushing this bigotry from the Free Congress Research and Education Foundation, a reactionary think tank and somewhat of a spiritual predecessor of PragerU.
We'll show you tonight that political correctness has been in the making for more than 8 decades. And it seems that a deteriorating society is exactly what political correctness strives for. But just what is political correctness? As you're about to see, political correctness is nothing less than a Marxist ideology. Marxism translated from economic into cultural terms in an effort going back not to the 1960s, but to World War I.
All around me are familiar faces.
The term critical theory is something of a play on words. One is tempted to ask, what is the theory? The answer is, the theory is to criticize. Through unremitting, destructive criticism of every institution of Western society, they hope to bring that society down.
Oh no! Criticism! Can't have that in a free society. That's what we label communism.
We have found the witch, may we burn her?
Critical theory actually attempted to politicize logic itself. Horkheimer wrote, "Logic is not independent of content." That means an argument is logical if it helps destroy Western culture, illogical if it supports it. Such twisted thought lies at the heart of the political correctness now inculcated into American university students.
Reactionaries spewed the same conspiracism about social justice, critical race theory, diversity, and wokeness.
Government will take care of you. Therefore, socialism enables a better society. I'm Peter Prager. Socialism and the welfare state destroy capitalism. We have a moral obligation to destroy ignorance. What more am I entitled to? Willful blindness. People know the truth, but choose to ignore it because PragerU videos.
When a misogynistic campaign known as Gamergate was popular in 2014 through 15, it laid the groundwork for internet redbaiting, largely copying Schlafly's Eagle forum, but as a subreddit. The real weirdo neckbeard Redditors are red pill manosphere misogynists. The fact is that redbaiters are thoroughly unoriginal, but they appeal to American nationalism in a way that can get presidents elected. Donald Trump learned his scaremongering directly from Roy Cohn. He is always on the attack with a new accusation to distract from his overwhelming ineptitude, just as McCarthy before him. He's got the constant conspiracism of a Bircher, which his father likely was a member of. He despises labor solidarity, immigrants, and social safety nets, parlaying that hatred into his key policy goals. He's indoctrinated his followers to ignore anything from the so-called mainstream media that reports on his wrongdoing because it's Lügenpresse, or fake news. It sounds better in the original German.
When you report fake news, which CNN does a lot, you are the enemy of the people.
After losing the 2020 election, he supported an attempted coup, utilizing demagoguery about the Red Menace to win the following presidential election.
You could go through her ideology. It's the ideology of a communist.
They skipped socialism. They went right down to communism.
Once in office, he pardoned all the insurrectionaries from his beer belly putsch.
These are the hostages. Approximately 1,500 for a pardon.
MAGA labels any creative expression they deem too aware of societal inequality as entartete Kunst, or woke. I prefer it in the original German. The entire crackdown on historical interpretation, from their attacks on academia to demanding so-called patriotic education, which is really just ultranationalist indoctrination wrapped up in a red, white, and blue bow, that's all Kulturkampf und Volksgemeinschaft. I mean, culture war nonsense for the sake of general obedience. I once again prefer it in the original German.
Say the line, Molly Evans.
I prefer Buchanan's speech in the original German.
But it's the leftists and liberals telling us what to say. Oh no! Someone told you that your bigotry is bigoted? Poor baby. If it was so unwarranted, then you shouldn't care. Ridicule them and move on.
Up yours, woke moralists. We'll see who cancels who.
Censoring history, as MAGA wants, clearly exemplifies a deep realization that they are in fact deserving of all such criticism, but are too cowardly to admit their hatred. My previous longest episode was about attacks on education, because that is, of course, what we are seeing now. And as I concluded in that, just ask yourself when anti-education activists claim that teachers are spreading anti-American hatred. If we can destroy America by teaching about its history, is it really worth saving? An empire that weak deserves failure. It's possible to educate good citizens and not have to indoctrinate them into denialism. But that is where we are headed. Go and check that episode out too. We've even got a new lavender scare with trans people, because diverting attention from Trump's innumerable failures requires nigh constant obsequiousness and perturbation. We are lucky that no lynchings have taken place, but he certainly isn't averse to the prospect of it. MAGA is a fascist movement, and their key tool is the tradition of American redbaiting. Eventually, I'll need to do an episode about the history of fascism.
I'm Dinesh D'Souza, a fascist, now more than ever, for Prager University.
Because this new iteration of Trump has most scholars of fascism confidently labeling it as such. Having begun studying historians' arguments on this, yeah, they're correct. But that's too divisive. Never mind the incessant vitriol reactionaries spew, scholars of fascism are somehow the ones being incendiary for highlighting what that rhetoric leads to. Remember, those who deny history wish to repeat it. But it should be fairly obvious that Trump is using this tradition of hatred to gain power, just as his idol, Roy Cohn, advised McCarthy to do 7 decades ago. Without understanding this incredibly lengthy history, one can easily fall for the deception of redbaiting, as MAGA supporters have. They literally adopted the phrase America first. Trump ran in 2024 saying,
I am your retribution, I am your retribution.
He frequently complained about anti-fascists destroying our cities during the race riots following George Floyd's murder, which is simply doing the old Bircher pro-segregation dog whistle of leftist infiltrators using civil rights to destroy the United States. It's awfully telling when you're complaining about anti-fascists opposing you, especially given what they oppose.
Bill's, kind of conservative.
It is thanks to you that the future of civilization is assured.
Wenn der Führer says, wie ist der Master Race, so be Heil, Heil, right in the Führer's face.
During his first State of the Union after his return, he pointed to centrist Democrats and called them radical left lunatics.
Our justice system has been turned upside down by radical left lunatics.
The bigotry is so obvious, yet Americans keep falling for it because they don't know this history. The American immigrant philosopher, George Santayana, said, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it." An important corollary is that those who deny history want to repeat it. Cruelty is the point. MAGA wants retribution by way of destroying civil rights. From denouncing radicals during Reconstruction for waving the bloody shirt, to denouncing radicals today pushing supposed anti-whiteness or anti-American or anti-traditional values or any of that nonsense, redbaiting seeks to destroy liberty by lying about leftists subverting it. We've gone from wide awakes to wokeness. Hopefully this episode is explanation enough for why redbaiting is a malignant rhetorical strategy. And the funny thing is, redbaiting is extremely ironic when you consider the patriotic ideal of free speech. They scaremonger about insurrection and subversion while instituting reactionary witch trials, as in they do the very thing they fear. The Capitol siege was an insurrection. No ifs, ands, or buts. Redbaiting is just a guise to prevent or retract socio-political progress. Of recent, rightists have used the Charlie Kirk assassination as an excuse to persecute liberals as supposedly condoning the violence, all while they openly call for war upon fellow Americans themselves and whitewash the reality of their escalations to the point of having to quash evidence that right-wingers are far more violent in this country and annihilate any semblance of liberty. I covered that in a recent episode too. It is dishonest and malicious to its core. If our system cannot withstand a bunch of commies saying they would prefer better circumstances, then our system doesn't deserve to continue. Both Cheka and crypto are correct. They'll crush us because we are so deluded with hatred as to destroy ourselves. Redbaiters are weaklings, destroying the very system they pretend to defend. Anyone who compulsively labels liberals and progressives as radical left lunatics is a reactionary, if not an outright fascist. They try to annihilate American freedom by denouncing anyone left of Mussolini as unpatriotic, never realizing that they are the very ones not living up to those ideals. Suppression of leftists should be considered un-American. It is literally a call for denying free speech. Sadly, redbaiting is just as American as systemic racism, patriarchy, and ethnic cleansing. Those who seek to deny this history simply want it to recur. Projection is at the heart of every recrimination about supposed leftist conspiracies. Redbaiting is nationalist oppression, not freedom-loving patriotism. By persecuting anything deemed woke or Marxist, they only prove themselves to be no better, if not worse, than the very villainy they denounce. Redbaiting is a tactic to move acceptable discourse further right, which has been extremely successful. Nowadays, Reagan's neoliberalism, an attempt to conserve or even revive laissez-faire capitalism, is the very thing reactionaries and fascists now call Marxist. Somehow Ronald Reagan was a secret Soviet spy the whole time. Woo! Most American pundits and politicians who call themselves conservative are much further right-wing than conservatism. And even most liberals here would be considered conservatives in other countries that haven't painted everything vaguely progressive with a red brush. We're at a level of depravity that fascism is so perfectly normalized that the highest office in the land is repeatedly and openly calling for warfare against some nebulous left, erasing the history of the far more prevalent right-wing extremism, removing nonpartisan oversight for supposed Marxism, and pushing ultra-nationalist indoctrination.
In other words, friend, facts do not care about...
They're making John Adams, quote, Ben Shapiro. How does this happen? This is on the White House's website. Ah! Yet it's the barely extant left that's un-American. Sure, reliance on redbait leads further and further right, bedeviling the American populace with an interminable ignorance that only fosters prejudice. Murrow was correct in quoting Shakespeare. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. Our own idiotic scaremongering and gullibility in allowing such openly asinine rhetoric to corrode our collective intellect only proves that redbait is symptomatic of a deeper rot. The more we allow redbaiting to infest our body politic, the more our worst demons return. As Nietzsche said, anyone who fights with monsters should take care that he does not, in the process, become a monster. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss gazes back into you. So that was my longest scripted episode, and what a doozy it was. If you've managed to make it this far, please give the video a like and, subscribe to the channel and all that kind of stuff. I'd like to thank my patrons on Patreon for, without their support, this massive effort would not have been possible. We are living through fearful circumstances. Historians are literally fleeing the country, and I too regularly receive death threats. For all the regime's bluster about how great America once was, they sure seem to be hell-bent on making it worse. I was emailing with a prominent historian in my field, and she noted that this channel's name was ever more applicable, and I replied, in terms of applying cynicism to the nation's present predicament, I like to use Oscar Wilde's definition. A cynic is a perpetually disappointed optimist. We gotta plan for the worst and hope for the best, even if we know that the worst outcome is the most likely. It's almost Sisyphean in the Camusian sense. Diogenes said humanitarianism was simply expounding one's philosophy no matter the resistance, and no one could shame him into doing otherwise. Hence why he'd search the agora with a lantern, looking for a true human being. Historians could learn from his example. Speak out, never allow this tyrant to assert his totalizing authority upon us, for we must find ways to resist. That is indeed what Patreon support helps me do, along with those who buy merch or come over to my Twitch channel and support me there. Thanks to all who can, and on with the outtakes. Hello, King. Oh, poor baby. Yes. Ah, crap, I'm supposed to have that book. It's in the other room. Hi. Hello. Thank you. Meow. Strong rolling. Meow. You don't like communism, huh? Oh, no. Would often publicly... never so... by the alembic of... that is not a word I ever use. FDR was a key ingredient of this, yet he died before the end of the war, leaving Harry S. Truman to fill his shoes.
Phrasing.
I just realized what I did there. To fill his shoes? I did not do that on purpose. But redbaiting continued unabated. Unabated? Come on.
Phrasing.
The whole of war production was under Jewish control.
That's an F-35. Uh-oh. About to have some B2 try to end my nuclear program here. Go away. For publishing the... Hello, King. Meow.